Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We have a good amount of people here. Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Tracy, and I'm the Communications Coordinator at the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. And today we are presenting our analysis on our newly released report, Achieving 100% Clean Electricity in the Southeast, Enacting a Federal Clean Electricity Standard. This is one of 4 webinars that we are hosting on the report, and this one is focused on NextEra Energy. There are also 3 other webinars, so if you haven't registered for those and you would like to, you can feel free to do that. We've already hosted one of them today. If you're unable to attend, we will be sending a recording of this webinar presentation, as well as the 3 other webinar presentations tomorrow afternoon, along with our corresponding blog post and, of course, the report itself. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We are accepting questions. We will be hosting a Q&A at the end of the webinar presentation. If you have a question, feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your Zoom screen and submit through there. If you're with a publication, we ask that you please denote which publication you're with. We will not be monitoring the chat box, so please make sure you are submitting through the Q&A box. If for some reason we don't get to all the questions, we'll send you a follow-up email, or you can reach out to the reporters. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Dr. Stephen Smith, who is SACE's Executive Director, and he will get us started.
Great. Thank you, Kate. And thanks everybody for joining. Sound quality good?
Yep, great.
Okay, good. So again, my name is Stephen Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, and we're very excited to share this analysis on what the Federal Clean Electricity Standard would look like with key utilities in the Southeast, and this one focusing in on Florida Power and Light, NextEra Energy, and the process in Florida. Let me just take a moment for just a little context. We've seen over the past week that President Biden has been at the international level talking with world leaders about the global climate crisis that is very profound and continues to grow. We also know that we're having a significant national debate here politically around an infrastructure bill that has a number of provisions, but one of the most important that we're anticipating should be in this infrastructure bill is the Clean Electricity Standard. The climate crisis is real. We're seeing devastating droughts and unprecedented heat wave in the Western United States. And this particular discussion, we're going to be zeroing in on the state of Florida. Florida, as we all know, has a very vulnerable coastline, is significantly impacted by sea level rise and extreme weather events. And so there are literally billions and billions of dollars at risk, and there's hundreds of millions of dollars that we've seen in damages, trending towards billions of dollars in damages from extreme weather events. And so we cannot ignore this problem. The Clean Electricity Standard is a key policy initiative that moves us in the right direction. It gets the electricity sector, the utility sector, down to zero carbon. And then it allows us to build out decarbonizing transportation and decarbonizing buildings and other things like that once we get this done. So we need the utilities to lead. And so that's exactly what the Clean Electricity Standard is intended to do. It needs to be part of this package and infrastructure. So I'm going to turn it over to Maggie. She's going to walk you through the analysis that she and her team did on why this is immensely possible and achievable in the Southeast, and in this particular webinar focused on what FP&L can do to lead in the state of Florida. Maggie?
Great. Thanks, Steve, for sort of setting us up. That was a great introduction to, sort of dig into why are we here? What are we talking about today? Why is this just, so very important? So as Steve mentioned, we're going to focus in on NextEra also known as Florida Power and Light, or FPL, today. And just a little bit of context, when we talk about NextEra or FPL, we're also including the Gulf Power territory, because, we're talking about 2030, 2035, we are assuming those two have merged. So taking a step back a little bit, where are we going today? What are we going to talk about? So first, we're going to start out with some context of what do we mean by the CES term? What is that? Why are we looking at that right now? I'm going to go over briefly our method and some of our assumptions. We have a lot more details on that in the appendices of the report, so I encourage you to look through those, or ask any questions that you have about sort of how we did what we did. I'm going to go over what our results were, what are some of the pathways that we see that FPL could take to get to this goal, and then some conclusions and next steps. As Kate mentioned, we're going to do Q&A at the end. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. We'll hope to leave quite a bit of time for that. And then, again, just looking at this slide, you can see in the dark blue parts of Florida, that is the NextEra territory that we're looking at today. And you can see it's a lot of coastline. It's a lot of very low-lying areas. So I think Steve's context is absolutely important to kind of frame what we're talking about today. So what is this clean electricity standard that we're talking about, that everybody's hearing about these days? So a clean electricity standard is a policy that has three main parts. Basically, it says that a utility or any entity or geography has to get a certain percent of their energy from a set of resources by a certain date. So those are the three things. What resources qualify, what percentage is the target, and when is the deadline. So it's also important to have some context here that this is not a new policy. There are over 30 states, territories, and the District of Columbia, and also now the city of New Orleans, all have these kinds of policies in place. Sometimes they're called different things, CES, or it can be called a Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS. And the very first one was set by Iowa back in the early 1980s. So this is not a new policy. This is not a new concept. In fact, a lot of states, a lot of utilities all across the country do have experience with meeting these kinds of targets. And I'll note that a lot, most of the RPS targets that were set have actually been far surpassed by their utilities. And then just to note something that Steve brought up, and here's a list of some of the proposals. This has been in the discussions around an infrastructure package by the Biden administration. There have been a number of proposals by various members of Congress, and I've listed some of the ones here, both in this Congress and in the previous Congress. And again, this is kind of defining those key elements. What are the resources? What's the percentage you're targeting? And when is the deadline? So why are we looking at this? Why are we looking at this in the Southeast, and why now? So as you saw on the previous slide, there have been several proposals for a federal clean electricity standard. And it's also important to note that a policy like this at the federal level would have an outsized impact on utilities in the Southeast. Why is that? Well, the first is that most states in the Southeast do not have their own policies like this. I mentioned earlier, 30 plus states and territories. North Carolina and New Orleans are the only places that have this kind of a binding clean or renewable standard here in the Southeast. And then the second is that the Southeast is dominated by the vertically integrated utility structure. What does that even mean? So that means that we don't have a wholesale market that covers, all or part of the region, which would then allow resources to compete on cost. Resources, the lowest cost resources right now are these clean electricity resources. And so we've seen a lot of other places all across the country that, fossil resources are retiring, coal in particular, but also some gas, and that it's largely replaced with non-emitting resources, mostly solar, mostly wind, a good amount of storage as well. And we're not seeing that same trend play out in quite the same pace here in the Southeast, where most of the resources that are built are determined through, utility integrated resource process. So what are we doing here in this report and this analysis? The goal was is to visualize what does 100% clean electricity look like here in the Southeast. And really this is intended to start a conversation with folks all across the region. So we want this to be something talked about with customers and policymakers, regulators, and utilities. I also think it's important to note what this analysis is not, and this is not a least cost optimization. That is a process that is usually reserved for that utilities use for resource planning. It's fairly resource intensive. It takes a while. That just wasn't what we were going for with this kind of analysis. And another thing that this is not is we didn't look closely at transmission or power flow analysis. We look a little bit at transmission between different utilities. We're not looking necessarily within the utility. And finally, this is not the maximum or most that any utility could achieve on any number of these resources. So later in the presentation and in the report, we'll give actual numbers. Well, this many megawatts of solar, this many megawatts of offshore wind, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't mean that that's the most that that utility could achieve by 2035. So these are pathways that we have, we are presenting and not not sort of the top end. All right, so here's a little snapshot about what we did. The most important thing was, well, what target are we assuming? So for FPL, we are assuming it would achieve 100% clean electricity by 2035. We didn't look at other years. This is just a snapshot of 2035 itself. And for these purposes in this analysis, we started with a definition of clean that includes wind, and solar, energy efficiency, existing nuclear, existing hydro, and biomass, existing biomass. What it does not include is any fossil gas. So on the method, again, there's a high level sort of chart here that shows you what we did, but also more details in the appendix of the report. We started with the load forecast, FPL's actual load forecast for 2035. We took out all of the fossil resources, that's all the coal and all the gas. And first we applied our distributed energy resource, DER assumptions. So that's energy efficiency, distributed solar, and demand response. Next, we looked at wind because we see that being really a more constrained resource in the Southeast. And we looked at 3 types of wind. How much Western wind can be brought in through expansions to existing transmission. How much onshore wind can we get? And in Florida, in most of our cases, very little onshore, we assumed very little onshore wind, but also what do the offshore wind resources look like? Once we had those set up, we added large scale solar and storage and sort of a generic other renewables category that we included, little small amounts in order to first meet the energy needs. So how many megawatt hours are needed for the entire year to, serve all the customers. And then we looked at reserve margins. So what's the capacity needed to meet reserve margins in both winter and summer? I'll say real quick about reserve margins that they are, what they are. They're a fairly high level tool used for reliability, just to make sure you have enough generation on the grid to meet your peak load. So if you have a utility with a 100 megawatt peak and a 15% reserve margin, that means that they need 15% more capacity than their peak. So they would need 115 megawatts. And finally, we checked each pathway that we developed against hourly load for peak days in both winter and summer. And then we looked at what a typical spring day would look like. All right. So we looked at two main pathways, and they're kind of described here. I'll start with, we were a little bit unsure with what we wanted to name each of these. So I'll go through the descriptions, and I think that'll become clear as I talk about it a little bit more. So the first one we started with, the one on the left here, is what we're calling a distributed energy resource, or DER focused pathway. So in this one, we have energy efficiency and distributed solar meet together about 1/3 of total energy needs by 2035. And we have demand response that's used on most peak days. So we started with those, and again, just kind of filled in the rest of what was needed with energy storage, onshore and offshore wind, and primarily utility scale solar to balance these out. And then we wanted to know, okay, well, what happens if that level of penetration for distributed energy resources is not achieved? These are still, higher levels of DERs than in the utility's current plan, but it's just not the same assumption as we had in our DER focused pathway. So in this one, DERs meet just over about 1/4, but less than 1/3 of the energy needs in 2035. And also there are lower levels of demand response available. So because there's less DERs, there's more of these large scale renewable resources needed. That's where we got the large scale renewable LSR pathway name. So both pathways have both kinds of resources, but one is more distributed, has more distributed, and one has more of the large scale. This is, important for us to think about, because especially with DERs, these are programs that the utility is, building up over time. And we think that with, a significant and especially consistent investment in energy efficiency and distributed solar, that this, 1/3 of energy needs could absolutely be met by 2035. But we still wanted to explore what would happen if they fell short of that. So what did we find? Well, there were two common themes in both of these pathways. The first is that a variety of clean resources just makes it easier to get to that 100% clean electricity. So you're not only going to build solar, you're not only going to get there with energy efficiency, you're not only going to get there with wind. So, a variety of these resources is really key. And then, perhaps most importantly, is that we start immediately, especially with both the distributed energy resources that, as I said, they take a while to build up. You can think of it as, you have an energy efficiency program where the utility is helping folks replace their air conditioners with more efficient when they replace these AC units. Well, not everyone is going to replace their AC in every year, and so you want to capture as many of those savings as we can over time. And then the second reason it's important to start now is for the large scale resources, especially things like offshore wind and building transmission projects and whatnot. These are projects that do not happen overnight. They take a significant amount of time and effort to get going and get online and operating. And the same thing with I mean, even the solar and the storage to get to the levels here, you know, it's only going to be easier if we start right away. So let's get into some of these results. So in our first pathway, our DER pathway, I have there's two bars here, and on the left is FPL's current utility plan. This is a combination of the plan for FPL and Gulf. It's notable that in Florida, the resource planning process is through what's called 10-year site plans. So they, as the name implies, only go out 10 years, but they do come out every year. So the latest one is from April. That bar on the left is based on the latest 10-year site plan for a combination of FPL and Gulf, and that is then projected out to 2035. And then on the right is what a DER-focused clean electricity standard portfolio would look like under these, you know, these sets of assumptions that we used here. So again, as I mentioned, energy efficiency and distributed solar together make actually over a third. Energy efficiency is 20% of energy needs. Distributed solar, 14% of energy needs. Just a note, the chart shows capacity. The percentages I'm talking about in the bullets, the first two bullets there are energy, just to make sure we're on the same page there. And then, of course, the remainder is met with large scale solar, storage, and some offshore wind. All right, so let's look at what some of these you know, days would look like under this DER portfolio for FPL. So this is a winter peak day under our DER focused pathway in 2035. And this is based on actual usage data from a peak day. And you can see in the chart, the dotted line is where electricity demand would have been without any charging for storage. And you can see that the gray, which is our storage discharging, that happens overnight. And then, you know, during the day when the solar is at its peak and generating, you're charging up that storage resource. We didn't have a specific type of energy storage in mind when we put this together. It's sort of a generic. It could be batteries, it could be pumped storage, it could be any number of things, probably a combination of things. But one requirement that we did put on it, which makes it a pretty conservative assessment, is that all of the storage needs to both charge and discharge within the same 24-hour period. So in order to discharge and meet the load in the morning and evening and nighttime hours, it is building additional solar to charge those batteries or whatever kind of storage it is during the day, so that it's available in the evenings and the night times. So obviously this means this is assuming we have the kinds of technology that we have that's available today right now. There are a number of things in the works, some of which FPL is actually looking at that could be done similarly but slightly differently. Things like long-term storage. I know that FPL is looking at how do we do, could they run some of their gas peaker plants on hydrogen and stuff like that. So I will get more into that option in one of the later slides. We look at this, but first let's look at a summer day. So this looks fairly similar. You can see that there is demand response. That green line at the bottom is both energy efficiency and demand response. So you can see some of your demand response is going during the nighttime, and you're also, again, using your batteries, using your storage to both charge and discharge. One thing that's really notable about the summer and winter peaks in FPL is that we didn't see something that we saw in some of the other utilities, which is excess generation. So you can see on this slide what I'm talking about excess generation. This is a spring day for FPL. And so this sort of light gray, translucent gray that's at the top, that is extra megawatt hours that the utility doesn't need, but that the solar and the wind is generating. Both the distributed solar, which is this light yellow, the large scale solar, which is the darker yellow, and then the wind, which is these different purples. So that's where, coming back to the hydrogen pilot that FPL has, hydrogen is one use for this excess generation. There are many, and we will see what the different innovations, R&D, and different programs look like, and see what actually makes sense for utilities to do. It could be shifting load to these times. It could look something like some other kind of longer term battery, or a number of different things. The point is, this excess generation that comes on spring days, fall days, and even some days in winter and summer, that's sort of an added bonus. And what do we get to do with that extra power? All right, so moving along, I'm going to talk now a little bit about the second pathway we looked at, which is this large scale renewable pathway. As described earlier, there's still a fair amount of DERs in this pathway. For FPL, it still meets about 30%, a little bit over, of the total energy needs by 2030. But most notably in this pathway, FPL has double the amount of offshore wind than in the DER focused pathway. There's also some changes in some of the other resources, but that one was by far the most interesting. I guess one last notable thing is that because there is more offshore wind, and the hourly profiles of wind and solar kind of complement each other very well, there was actually less energy storage needed in this pathway than in the DER focused pathway. All right, so we wanted to look at a few other scenarios just to see, what other things could impact some of the results. And for FPL, there were two of those that were relevant to FPL. The first one is comes out of the analysis that we did for the DER and LSR focused pathways, which is a lot. We were seeing that a lot of the storage, or some of the storage, was being built to meet reserve margin needs, but not necessarily being used to meet peak load needs. And what would happen if we left some gas combustion turbine plants in a state where they could be turned on for emergencies, but they're not running at all. So they're not actually generating, they're not actually emitting CO2. In the industry, we call that mothballed, so they can be used. They're there sort of just in case. And to do that, we left those gas turbines online, or on the books for the reserve margin calculations, but we did not make them available to meet any of the energy needs, the annual energy needs, or the peak load needs. So interestingly, the result for FPL was the smallest change between this assumption and having no gas turbines at all when compared to some of the other utilities. So 430 megawatts less of storage needed if you leave those gas turbines on, compared to a total of 11.3 gigawatts. That's just not not such a big change. So just some interesting results. It means that not only would FPL be building storage to meet its reserve margin target, it would actually be using it more so than some of the other utilities. We also looked at an assumption where offshore wind was not available, either not available in time in 2035 or for some other reason. And as expected, the results of this means that there's a lot more large-scale solar needed within that time frame. All right. So what do we take away from all of this? I mean, the first is pretty obvious takeaway, which is that a clean electricity standard, it's possible. We can get to 100% clean electricity. We have options on how we get there. And so, we should shift the conversation away from can we do this and towards how do we do this? And we presented a few ways that we think would be, possible pathways towards 100% clean electricity here. And this is again intended to sort of start this conversation. Some other conclusions we reached in this process is that there are two things that would definitely make this pathway to 100% clean electricity easier. Easier meaning you can get there more quickly, or you can get there with fewer resources, you can get there with lower costs, those kinds of things. And the first is that, as we mentioned, meeting these reserve margin targets and meeting peak load is really driving the need for resources such that there's extra generation during a lot of the days of the year. And one thing that other parts of the country have that we don't, that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, is this idea of a wholesale electricity market. One of the things with that is you have, for a whole region, you have a reserve margin and you share reserves across the whole region. SACE has presented previous analysis that shows the Southeast utilities don't all peak at the same time. And so having the ability to share these resources among utilities and not have everyone sort of treated as an island and building just for themselves, it really does reduce the costs overall. The second one I think is really key. So we did this analysis with existing technologies in mind. We were, very intentional about only using technologies that are, commercially available today. But that doesn't mean that we think that, those are only going to be the technologies available and only should be the technologies used between now and 2035. Continuing to do R&D into these resources, improving existing resources, bringing new technologies, to commercialization. These are all also super important. So instead of having, a trade-off between do we deploy technologies that we know work and are cost effective, or do we do R&D? We really think it should be both, and both of them are important. I think also it's pretty clear from this analysis that we're not really at risk of investing too early or too much in these clean resources. So, it's not that we're going to say, oh, whoops, we installed too much solar. Now what are we going to do with it? We obviously need a lot of all of these resources, and especially important to invest early and sustain our investment in energy efficiency and distributed solar to meet these targets. And then something that Steve mentioned at the outset that is important here. We didn't look at this closely, but with clean electricity, obviously goes hand in hand with electrification. Any emission reductions you are gaining through your electricity sector, if you are electrifying other sectors that directly combust fossil fuels, such as transportation, such as buildings, as you electrify those sectors, you're also cleaning them up as well. So again, this is the start of a conversation. More analysis on this is needed, and this should absolutely be a part of every utilities resource plan moving forward. And the next step is, what is this federal clean electricity standard going to actually look like? What is it? What is going to become law? All right, and so with that, I think we're doing okay on time. And I'm going to turn it back over to Kate so we can do some Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maggie. That was excellent. So I want to start us off with a little bit of a broad question, and Steve might want to chime in on this one too. But why is it important to pass a clean electricity standard as opposed to going through regulatory processes that are already in place? And maybe talk a little bit about the cost of inaction and what it means in terms of the climate crisis.
Well, let me jump in real quick, and then Maggie, you add to this. First of all, we are not seeing leadership in the state of Florida at either the legislative or the regulatory level on addressing the climate crisis that is impacting Florida. So if we had a healthy regulatory system and we had leadership happening at the legislative level or at the administrative level in Florida, a federal policy may not be necessary. But there are a number of advantages of federal policy. And I think because this is a national and actually a global issue, it's appropriate for the federal government to engage and lead through a national policy like this, because it allows the federal government to sync up with international commitments. It allows the federal government to apply sort of an even across the board approach to all 50 states so that everyone is working together. And there are efficiencies that are gained by having a national policy on renewable energy and advancing and reducing carbon emissions. So again, the premise of the question, if I understood it correctly, is that you have a healthy and working regulatory apparatus that is actually taking into account a lot of the externalities and a lot of the things that are, we in essence have a market failure, because a lot of the impacts associated with climate change are not being properly brought into the overall market calculus of the cost of energy and the impacts that it has on individual customers and on society writ large. So when you have that kind of market failure, the regulators have to step in. But if you have regulatory capture and you're not actually having the leadership, then you basically don't have the issues being addressed. So that's why we're very supportive of the federal policy.
Okay, Maggie, is there anything you wanted to add on to that?
I think that covered it very well.
I think so too. Okay, here is a question. There are many areas just about the scope of the report and potentially replicating it to other utility systems. There are many areas in Florida that are not covered by NextEra or Duke, and we presented on Duke earlier today. How does this report and its findings related to those of us living in communities served by rural co-ops or municipal utilities not served by Duke or NextEra?
Yes, this is absolutely a great question. While we wish we could have, done this analysis for every utility, we were, we're somewhat limited in the time and resources to get this analysis out. And but I think it is fairly, easy to look at what is in the pathways for the 4 utilities that we covered, which I'm not sure if we went over this, but in addition to NextEra, we also looked at Duke, and then also TVA and Southern Company. And so we focused on, those are the 4 biggest in the region that we cover. And so we focused on them for this analysis, but absolutely the same findings, general findings apply, that investments in energy efficiency, investments in distributed solar, and starting early are really key, no matter the size of the utility or, its ownership structure, whether it's a municipal or a rural co-op. Now, how you talk about that and how you, look at the planning, I mean, different kinds of utilities and utilities in different states have different regulations around how they plan their resources, what sorts of programs they can have about energy efficiency and about distributed solar. So some of those things are, definitely more tailored, but I think the high level results, would apply across the board.
And let me just add in, FP&L is by far the largest player in the state of Florida. And the parent company, NextEra Energy, is a national leader on renewable energy. And if there is a federal policy, and if FP&L can get into alignment, there is an awful lot that I think FP&L is already leading on a sort of pounds per megawatt hour basis in the state of Florida in their emissions in many ways, but giving them even more momentum and giving them even more incentive through the sort of proper regulatory market alignment, they're going to be able, I think, to really help a lot of the other areas get where we need to be across the whole state of Florida. So it's not, as Maggie said, it's not that we're neglecting any of these areas. It's just that, with the resources we had to go with the big ones, and FP&L is by and large the largest one, and I think will be a huge piece of the overall puzzle in solving a decarbonization of the electric sector in Florida. Whether you love them or hate them or however you feel about FP&L, they're just clearly the 800-pound gorilla in the state, and getting them better aligned to go to zero carbon is good for the whole state of Florida.
Okay, thanks, y'all. So we have a couple questions on the analysis itself. Is there a way to extend the analysis to consider operating reserves as well as the planning reserve margins you considered? With such high levels of variable renewables, looking across operating reserve needs is increasingly important to ensure reliability.
Yes, I suspect this one came from someone who works very closely with utilities or possibly for a utility, and I really appreciate that because, these are the kind of, wonky technical stuff I like to get into. Unfortunately, this was not within the scope of what we were looking at here, but it's an important issue, and it is something that, that folks should be adding to analysis when they're looking at how do we get to 100% clean electricity. I'll use this question to add in that, it's pretty clear from the shifts that we've shown, but I think it's worth stating, this policy, it would require a shift in the way utilities plan and operate their systems on a day-to-day basis. I mean, the hourly, the daily load profiles we showed, that's not how utilities typically do it at this point in time. It's not to say it's not possible, but it just means, that there's going to be some changes to the way that things are done. So I think looking at operating reserves, is certainly super important and something to consider there. I think one last point of this, I realize I'm taking this question and going in a few different directions, but the other piece about utilities, changing up the way that they do their operations, this is another reason why it is important to start soon. The more experience that utilities can get with these, new resources, working with just so many distributed resources on their grid, working with new kinds of demand response programs, working with new rate structures, working with different kinds of energy storage technologies. These will all, take some getting used to in a way. And so it's important that we, start that now so that utilities are, learning and adapting, and I think can absolutely, adapt to those kinds of new technologies and new different kinds of programs.
Okay, And another question about the analysis, which I think you'll like. How many of these snapshot days during the year did you look at in the analysis?
Yep. So we just looked at 3 for each pathway. So it was actually the same 3 for each pathway. So 3 total, 1 peak winter day, 1 peak summer day, and then 1 sort of typical spring day.
Okay. And this next question is for SACE's Solar Program Director, Brian Jacob. He's also on the call. And just to let everyone know, he is working on a report, the 4th annual solar report that will be released very soon. So look out for that. But this question is, we have a few questions for Brian. How realistic are your distributed solar assumptions? They seem very high.
Yeah, thanks. Well, they are ambitious. I think fulfilling 100% clean electricity by 2035 is ambitious. And maybe the root of the question is that it is looking at where we are rather than looking at the future and where we're trying to get to. Because I guess it's fair to say that we don't have a whole lot of distributed solar in the Southeast right now. Very few of our utilities have even achieved 2% of distributed solar, and here we're talking about significant penetrations of distributed solar. So just so you'll know, what we did is we used the NREL technical potential study, which was done several years ago, and they analyzed the suitability of rooftops. They did the whole country. We just looked at the states of the Southeast. But even then, we didn't use the total technical potential that NREL had come up with. We ratioed that down about approximately a third, and said that is what we could expect to achieve by 2035 here in the Southeast. So I would say that it is entirely possible, and that was the whole intent of this exercise, was to demonstrate that there are portfolios that could allow the largest utilities in the Southeast to fulfill 100% clean electricity standard by 2035. You say you had another one?
Yes, I do. Thanks for answering that one. Would utilities most likely need to retain renewable energy credits of customer-owned solar systems to get to 100% clean energy by 2035?
Yeah, and this question had come up in the Duke session earlier today as well. And it's something that I think we need to take a closer look at. In fact, Kate, you mentioned that we've got the Solar in the Southeast report coming out next week as well. And I've touched on it in there, that we're starting to see a lot of contracts between customers and solar projects, whether they're virtual PPAs or sleeve PPAs or green tariffs, and there's different structures in different states, but they're being done across state lines, and that kind of blurs the line of accounting for how these things are attributed. And it'll become very obvious with one of the large projects that was done for a municipal utility within the TVA system in our report next week. But one of the things that surfaced is that we do need to make sure that there is transparency in how the accounting's done. And so to this question, I think all the different CES bills that are currently being proposed, the ones that Maggie went over at the beginning, they all have sort of different nuances to them. And depending on how they're structured, there may be a scenario where renewable energy certificates will need to be retained by the utilities and retired against those CES objectives. And I think those are just details that have to be worked out as the bills move forward.
Okay, and one more question for you that Maggie might want to help out with. Isn't Florida unusual in two ways? Better for solar due to being further south, but uneconomic for wind power.
I don't know for sure that it's uneconomic for wind power, but it is certainly a good solar resource state. It has the good solar availability, and certain parts of the state still have good land availability, and of course that there's quite a balance there, because you want your solar projects to be as close to the load centers as possible, but in order to get the economics to work, you typically have to have they're generally installed in more rural areas, because you're talking about 500 acres or more for some of these larger solar projects that are going into the state of Florida. So I guess the question sounded like, is it a good solar resource state for Florida? And absolutely, the answer is yes. And I'm not sure about wind opportunities for the state.
Yeah, on the wind piece, we did assume offshore wind in the state of Florida, and we do see, while Florida doesn't have the best offshore wind resource in the country, it does have some offshore wind potential, particularly in sort of north and east, and also in the Gulf. And we're actually seeing some interest in the administration of exploring, what does offshore wind in the Gulf look like. So there are some options for sure for Florida for wind power.
Okay, let's bring this back a little bit to like a higher level. The federal CES bills that have been proposed in Congress over the last few years all have an alternative compliance payment option to provide cost relief. How does that fit in with your analysis and recommendations in the report? The prices set forth seem to be lower than the marginal cost of removing all the carbon from the fleet. Will utilities feel that this is too much too soon?
Yes, I like this question. Well, not that this is too much too soon, but yes, that this is a good question. And it is something that is very important to policy design. And I'll say we probably won't get it right from the start. It'll be something that would need to be adjusted. But the way I see alternative compliance payments, or ACPs as they're abbreviated to, is that is a cap on the cost of meeting the policy. So for instance, if you have an ACP that starts at $50 a megawatt hour, you can easily invest resources at $50 a megawatt hour or less, and to get to that target. But the idea that utilities having to pay an ACP is sort of setting us back from the policy. I don't necessarily agree with that, but it depends on what you do with the funds that are raised from those ACP, alternate compliance payments that the utilities are making. So first off, why are the utilities, why would they be paying the ACP instead of installing something? Well, maybe it's actually more expensive to do, than the ACP. Or maybe there's some sort of shortages, labor shortages, land shortages, something's going on. Well, a lot of policies will set it up so that the funds that go in, from the ACP go back to projects that actually help the utility meet the goal. So you're going to make it easier to meet the goal the next year and the next year and the next year. And so that's really good policy, because you're having those dollars be spent usually by a state, or sort of setting up what's called a green bank, and funding projects, funding renewable energy directly, funding energy efficiency directly. And then the utility, the next year does not have to pay maybe as many or maybe any at all of those ACPs to meet that next target.
Okay, Thank you. And I think we have time for just a few more questions. So if we did not get to your question, and you perhaps submitted your question anonymously, you can resubmit it with your name so we can make sure to reach out to you, or you can just email us your question. Okay, so this next question is asking, oops. Here we go, sorry. Electric vehicles are set to increase exponentially. Does this report factor in the need for this additional electricity load or needs?
So I'll take this one too. As I said in the method section, we started with the utility's own load forecasts. So we are looking at electrification to the degree that utility forecasts it on their system. But absolutely, this is one of those sort of needs more analysis buckets because you know, as the forecast for the level of electrification goes up, it will change how many and what kinds of resources are needed, and so we're just going to have to keep those two in lockstep as we move forward.
Yeah, and let me jump in here real quick, Kate. The question's an excellent one because we agree that the decarbonization of the transportation sector is critically important and that we do expect it to grow exponentially. And I think a lot of people are underestimating how quickly it's going to move. But remember that when you have, at least the way electric cars are being designed right now, you will have a storage unit sitting in your driveway. And as we begin to look at things like vehicles to grid and other things like that, there are some opportunities for utilities to potentially integrate electric vehicles in a more comprehensive way that may allow them to do some innovative things that they haven't been able to do before. So this could cut both ways. So we'll see how it advances, but yes, it's coming and coming faster than people realize.
Okay, two more questions, both looking at just clean electricity standard in general. This one is for Brian. A clean electricity standard is a key element of the American Jobs Plan. How many jobs will this create?
Oh, I wish I had a real precise answer for that. Well, so I guess if I take a step back, back when Joe Biden was running for president before the election, he was talking about 10 million clean energy jobs. But for solar, I can give a more precise answer, I guess. The solar job census comes out every year, and it was released about a month ago now. And nationwide, there were, I think it was 233,000, 235,000 solar jobs. But the main emphasis of that release of that report was that if the industry is going to fulfill a 100% clean electricity standard by 2035, it would require 4 times as many solar workers. So there need to be about almost 900,000 versus the 233 or so thousand that were presently there. In Florida, I'd have to look back at the specific numbers, but I think it was around 12,000. And so you can imagine that if that needs to quadruple in order to fulfill the pace of development of solar resources that would align with a 100% clean electricity standard, then you'd be needing about 45 to 48,000, maybe 50,000 solar workers in the state of Florida. So there's a lot of job creation opportunity. I think that's the bottom line.
Okay, great answer. And sorry to potentially throw a curveball at you. So we're a little bit over, so I just want to remind everyone in case they need to hop off, but we're going to ask one more question. This will be sent out tomorrow as a recording, as well as the 3 other recordings, the complimentary blog post and a link to the report itself. But this last question, I think Steve or Maggie can answer this. What are potential barriers to getting a clean electricity standard passed, and what can we do to support it?
Well, that's a loaded question. I think there's a lot of interesting discussions going on in Washington, and we hope that everyone that is engaging in those discussions is engaging in those discussions in good faith. It is a little unclear how the partisan gridlock is going to navigate this. There is an issue that if the Republican Party decides that they do not want to support the infrastructure bill, and there are not 10 that are willing to vote in favor of it, it then has to go through what's called budget reconciliation, which means that all Democratic senators would have to vote, and then there would likely be a 50-50 where the vice president would break that vote. It appears that there is momentum to pass something like this in the House. And so working through the partisan gridlock is the biggest threat. I think making sure that all elected representatives at the federal level, both in the House and the Senate, are hearing from folks about the importance of this, and then also making sure that in the attempt to try to gain some sort of facade of bipartisan support, that there isn't key provisions that are sort of tossed overboard. And so there is concern that some Republicans may not want to support climate-related issues, and so the clean electricity standard could potentially be jettisoned. There does seem to be a lot of discussion about whether then more progressive Democrats would vote for a bill that doesn't have carbon provisions in it. So you can see, I could go on and on about these sort of tug of war between policy and politics, but that is where we are now. We are getting deep into the sausage making and the politics of Washington, D.C. And unfortunately, we do not have a crystal ball, but everyone who is hopefully in earshot of this discussion can weigh in with their elected officials and let them know how they feel.
Yes, and we do have an action for that, which will be sent out with the follow-up email for this webinar as well. So you can take action with us and contact your member of Congress. I want to thank everyone for joining us today and registering, and for all of our panelists for answering a good amount of questions. We hope you enjoyed this analysis, and please reach out to us if you have any questions.